Good morning, everyone. My name is Kate Bowditch. I'm the relatively new president at Essex County Greenbelt, and really happy to be here in this beautiful spot in Haverhill this morning. Since I'm relatively new to this area, I came from Charles River Watershed Association. I was there for almost 24 years before I joined Greenbelt. I've actually worked with Katie a little bit on a fair number of climate change issues, and so this is something that's really near and dear to my heart. I'm a hydrologist by training, so thinking about land and water is a lot of what I've worked on over most of my career. And it turns out now that I've come to Greenbelt, which really focuses on land conservation and land stewardship and getting people out onto the land, there's really a tremendous overlap between the work that watershed associations do and land trusts do. So it's been a very nice experience for me to join this wonderful group here at Greenbelt and start learning some new things, but also realize that many of the things that I already have been working on and am familiar with fit right in with the group. So want to just first of all thank the HC Media Center for hosting us today. This is a great facility and it's a terrific location, really beautiful, and so we're delighted to be able to be here. And thanks also to Wicked Big Coffee, which will keep us going all morning, I'm sure. For those of you who may not know Greenbelt, just very briefly, we are a land trust, a land conservation organization. We work throughout Essex County, which is a big county, actually about the same size as the Charles River watershed. So a familiar size for me to be working in, 35 cities and towns, big area, river issues, wetlands, coastal issues, so lots and lots to think about, particularly through the lens of a changing climate and how we ought to be thinking about the future and what we need to be doing. Greenbelt has three focus areas, which I mentioned: land conservation, which is preserving land in its basically natural state, an open state, so that it can continue to function for us in a healthy way and create a better future than we might have otherwise if we don't protect that land. We're also actively engaged in stewardship and management of our land, and turning out to be more and more important, especially as we think about climate change. And then, of course, community engagement, which is what we're doing right now. Working with people, getting people out onto the land to experience those wonderful trails and places where people can go and be outside in nature and really have that experience. And if you haven't seen, I think Jane probably brought some of our postcards that list a lot of the events that we have going on all through the winter and of course into the spring and summer season as well. So, but with that, I am really excited to be able to introduce Katie Theoharides as our speaker. As in the new Assistant Secretary of Climate Change position created by the Baker-Polito administration, Katie directs the Commonwealth's Climate Change Program, which works across state government and with cities and towns to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, so mitigation, and also to adapt to the impacts and opportunities from climate change, so mitigation and adaptation, with a major focus on mainstreaming climate change into the daily work of state and local government. And I can say from my experience working with Katie in the administration that she has been tremendously effective, and I'm really delighted she's here with us. Katie.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you to the Essex County Greenbelt for inviting me to speak today. I'm also really grateful for the coffee. We had our third child 2 months ago, so if I'm if I'm falling asleep mid-slide, that's the reason. But the coffee is good. I am here to talk today a little bit more specifically about a program that we have for municipalities that we're really proud of and working on, but I thought I would give a little bit of a background sort of to the administration's approach to climate change and then talk more specifically about our municipal program. This is a picture from Scituate last winter during one of the 4 major nor'easters that we had, and as you can see, it's sort of terrifying when you look at how isolated those houses are out in the ocean that came in. A picture again. As I think many of you are probably familiar with at this point, climate change is something that in Massachusetts is not a political issue. It's something that Governor Baker has fully committed state resources to, and this administration certainly doesn't see it as something that needs political argument. It's something that's ongoing. It's a reality, and we see both the solutions to climate change from a mitigation perspective, but also the work of adaptation as something that will strengthen communities, grow economies, and importantly, protect our natural resources. I wanted to cover just a little snapshot of the changes that we're seeing in Massachusetts. Not going to go into full details here. These are some of the observed changes we've been seeing. So since 1895, almost a 3-degree temperature rise average across the state. That's not looking at seasonal changes or extreme changes, but just an average 3-degree temperature increase. We're also seeing growing seasons lengthen, so 15 days more of growing season. Sometimes that's a good thing for crops we're trying to produce more of. It also means there's 15 more days that weeds and invasive species and things like that can grow. Sea level rise, already 11 inches of rise, and heavy precipitation events. Here in the Northeast, we're actually seeing the largest increase across the country in terms of heavy precipitation events, a 55% increase. What are we going to see by the end of the century? This is where things get a little bit more dramatic. So average across the state, about a 7.5-degree increase in temperature. This one I think is big to me, and it's something we focus on less, but extreme heat. By the end of the century, we could see an additional 34 days of above 90 degrees. So we see about 7 to 10 now, and that would put us more on the range of over a month of days above 90 degrees. That puts us more in a climate like Georgia or North Carolina rather than Massachusetts. By the end of the century, we could be seeing up to 10.5 feet of sea level rise, which is very significant, and then an increase of almost 50% in days with more than 2 inches of rain. And I know if anyone has been frustrated by the weather this fall, with rain almost every other day and some of it heavy, that's the kind of precipitation we're looking at in the future. Just a little snapshot of how important mitigation is, so reducing greenhouse gases. The 2 different bars here, red shows the current trajectory of emissions that we're on, and how the number of days above 95 degrees would increase if we stay on that trajectory. We have sort of an opportunity to keep that temperature increase much lower if we reduce our emissions more to a moderate emissions pathway, or what nations around the world have agreed to under the Paris agreements. But there's a big difference in what we'll see based on how much greenhouse gas we're putting out into the atmosphere. So Massachusetts, we're lucky, has always been a real leader, certainly in the nation, on climate change. This is just a snapshot. The Nature Conservancy actually put this together, of different climate policy and actions that have been taken starting in 2008 with the passage of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And that act requires us to meet targets for emission reductions. The first one that's coming up is a 25% reduction by 2020 from our 1990 levels of greenhouse gases. That act also required us to start addressing climate change adaptation, which is what I'll be mostly focused on today, but to really look at the impacts from climate change to the state and what the state needs to do to prepare for those impacts. And so a report was produced in 2011 looking at those impacts, looking at adaptation options. And since then, the state has really been working on how do we formalize that? How do we build the institutional capacity? How do we plan for climate change impacts? And how do we help all of our communities and different groups deal with these impacts? So some of the two bigger initiatives that have happened under the Baker administration have been Governor Baker's executive order back in September of 2016, which looked both at accelerating the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and also preparing for these impacts of climate change. And it required us to develop a statewide adaptation plan, to appoint climate change coordinators across state government, so not just in the environmental agencies where I am, but all across state government, everywhere from human health to education to Department of Corrections. We have folks working on climate change issues. It also required all of our agencies to go through a vulnerability assessment process, looking at their risk to climate change and what they can do to address it. And then one of the big focuses, and I think has been a focus of the Baker administration generally, is partnerships between municipal government and state government to address climate change. These requirements and the executive order were recently codified into law through the environmental bond bill that passed this fall. And this was a $2.4 billion bond bill, and the real focus was on climate change. And so there's significant new funding in the bond bill for climate change adaptation and doing the work that's required to build resilience. And as I mentioned, it does codify these requirements from the executive order, and I'll talk more about some of the programs created through that. One of the first things we did was to make sure that as we're preparing for climate change, all of the work we're doing is really science-based. And so data and science underlie all of the program and policy work we're doing. And as part of that, we worked with the Northeast Climate Science Center at UMass Amherst to develop downscaled climate projections just for Massachusetts at the watershed and county scale. So I don't know if any of you saw the National Climate Assessment that came out just after Thanksgiving. It was sort of buried on Black Friday from the federal government. But that's a compilation of information and science and data that comes out every 4 years on climate change. And we wanted to do something similar in Massachusetts and just make it Massachusetts specific. So we have developed this website with the Northeast Climate Science Center that shows that anyone can go to look at the changes that we're going to be seeing and to keep track of the changes that we already are seeing. So this is resilientma.org. This information really forms the basis for our municipal work and for the statewide plan that we just published back in September of this year. The executive order, as I mentioned, required the governments every 5 years to produce a plan looking at the challenges from climate change and how the state will adapt to climate change. And one of the things we decided to do, working very closely with MEMA, the Emergency Management Agency in Massachusetts, is to combine their natural hazard mitigation plan. Many of you are probably familiar with that type of planning at the municipal level with this new focus on climate adaptation. And so we've looked at this, we've looked at all of the hazards a hazard plan would normally consider in the context of how climate change is going to shape those hazards. And that's, I think, one of the challenges of climate change and of understanding climate change is that they're not all new changes. Much of it is exacerbation of existing things that we're used to. And so this is one of our efforts to mainstream climate change into an existing planning document that many people are familiar with, and that's also attached to federal funding. The plan, I'm not going to go through all of these, but as I mentioned, it looks at 14 natural hazards and how climate change is going to exacerbate those. Those are anything from storm surge and sea level rise to extreme heat. It looks at the risk for different sectors. It also looks at the existing capabilities state agencies have. So what are the policy mechanisms, the funding streams, the different ways state agencies can deal with some of these challenges. And then the key part of it is a strategy for implementation. We engaged over 500 stakeholders in the planning process, which was over 2 years. And the plan is sort of an open living document. And as we work towards the next iteration that's due in 5 years, there will be an implementation group working on implementing actions coming out of it, but also on continuing to integrate new data and update the plan. Again, I'm going to leave these slides so that you have them and I don't have to go through them. But there were a number of goals, and from these goals, 108 recommended actions developed by stakeholders in our agencies. And they're very focused on reducing risk, increasing institutional capacity, changing policies, plans, and programs to reflect climate change, and really looking for performance-based solutions. One of the biggest areas we feel that we've gained capacity is through our new program on municipal vulnerability to climate change. And this is called our Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. Any of you work on it or work on it in your communities? Okay, so a handful. We rolled this program out in 2017, and we now have about 43% of the state participating in the program. It's a direct grant from the state to communities. And so it is really focused on helping the community, providing technical assistance to the community to do the work of planning for climate change, considering the risks from climate change, and then implementing strategic actions to address those vulnerabilities. And we have worked on this program in partnership with a lot of great different partners, but particularly the Nature Conservancy and Mass Audubon, who have just been tremendous in supporting us through this effort. We're actually using what's called the Community Resilience Building Workshop Guide, which is a product of the Nature Conservancy. And it's, for anyone who's done any community level planning, it's not rocket science. It's very similar to any community-led process you might go through, really focused on engaging local citizens and local knowledge in the process, something that's accessible and repeatable, and something that utilizes existing infrastructure in the community, existing partners, existing experts, and sort of turning that knowledge, bringing all that local knowledge in, and putting it under the lens of climate change. The grant for the planning process covers what is a pretty simple process. The community has to prepare for a workshop and conduct outreach to get relevant stakeholders in the room. And then it's a 1 to 2 session workshop of about 8 hours total, where the community works through this process from steps B through F to think about their hazards, to identify their vulnerability, and also really importantly to identify community strengths, what's unique about the community that already exists that's going to help it deal with climate change, and then to work through those understanding of those vulnerabilities and strengths to begin to identify priority actions. And there's a real focus on getting more granular and prioritizing what those next steps will be, with the idea that, well, this is a small planning grant, it will lead to direct funding for larger projects, on the ground projects that will help with climate change. I think importantly, our focus with this has been that climate change is an opportunity to build community resilience. So this is not just about water and heat and increased diseases and all of the challenges that come with climate change. At a sort of fundamental level, it's about building more resilient, stronger communities, strengthening existing connections between people and communities, strengthening existing natural resources, open space, green infrastructure in communities, and making sure emergency management systems are in place. So it certainly has to be looking at climate change, but we think overall it really just builds that fabric of resilience in communities. The program has now expanded to include not just the planning grant I mentioned, which tends to be a smaller grant, somewhere on the order of $20,000 to $100,000 if you're a bigger community, to action grants. And action grants are where the money comes in. If you're a community that has completed a planning grant, you're then eligible for action grants. And action grants are upwards of about $1 million of funding for actual projects or more sophisticated planning. Our first year of action grants was last year. We actually capped the grants at about $400,000 a project, but we're looking at expanding that number for this next round. For a community that's completed a planning grant, there is a requirement to sort of maintain your designation every year. And you can do that by submitting a progress report and showing that you've made taken simple steps towards implementing the priority actions you've identified in your plan. These are some examples. Applying for grant funding would count, doing something like right-sizing culverts, something from your plan, reconvening your core team that's been part of the planning process to revise your actions or revise your plan. So that's just a note for communities who are already in this. We try to make things very simple. So we provide communities with a progress report template. Once you've completed the planning, the action grant, as I mentioned, is focused on implementing those actions identified through the plan. We're really looking for projects that have been thought through to address climate change, that are proactive, clearly demonstrating efforts to redesign, reevaluate, or reconsider and incorporate new climate change data. And then one of the big focuses of this grant, and something I know there's a session on today, is utilizing nature-based strategies to address climate change impacts. And these are things like green infrastructure, land conservation, strategies that either utilize existing nature, strategies that mimic natural solutions, or strategies that work in tandem with more traditional approaches. And we really feel that these strategies are cost-effective and have a real opportunity to reduce risk. And there's something that we're prioritized in the environmental bond bill. There's actually language prioritizing those types of solutions. This is a slide I stole from Sarah Burns and Steve Long at TNC. But the idea is that these types of nature-based solutions, like open space preservation, like restoring a salt marsh, can address these different types of hazards, flooding, erosion, heat. And they can lead to significant avoided costs. They often are cheaper to implement themselves, and they save money because you don't have the impact at the end of the day. They enhance safety, and they provide other environmental services. Often, I think a great example is street trees in communities. And so street trees have all of these different benefits. They reduce stormwater, they provide carbon mitigation and sequestration, they cool down buildings and reduce the heating and cooling requirements, and they also just make the community nicer. So they have a multitude of benefits, whereas something like installing an air conditioning unit to cool a building might have one benefit, which is cooling the building. If you add a shade tree, you're producing multiple benefits. How am I in time? Wait, do you know? 10 minutes? Okay, perfect, thank you. Before I go into specifics, I wanted to make sure I'm not rambling too much. So there's a number of different categories for our action grants. And we wanted to give sort of an example of some of the ones that came in this year. We had about 37 projects for our action grants this year. We are taking projects that look at more detailed vulnerability and risk assessment. So our planning grants are really a community-focused project effort, sort of a quick and dirty assessment of community vulnerability. If a community feels that they need to do a more detailed assessment of, for example, stormwater infrastructure in the community, that's something that would qualify for an action grant. And the City of Gloucester is taking on such a study. We're also looking at public education and communication grants. So there is sort of a need in many communities to get more buy-in for this type of work. And so we will support these types of campaigns through these action grants. One of the really interesting projects we had apply this year was from the City of Holyoke, who is trying to use an experience they had with Hurricane Maria survivors, many of whom came to Holyoke after the hurricane, trying to draw lessons learned from how that transition worked, and it did work really smoothly in Holyoke. So that was an interesting project we got. As there's more climate refugees coming from places that have been hit by these types of storms and extreme weather events, how do we make that kind of process go smoothly? We will also help develop local bylaws, ordinances, plans, and other management measures that communities want to take on. Brookline is looking at something like this. As I mentioned, redesigns and retrofits are something we're really looking for, and we will fund any stage of that process. So whether it's planning for it, whether it's getting it permitted, engineering plans approved, we will fund, or actually doing the work, we will fund any portion of that. In Peabody, they're looking at a resilient river walk and park, and so we're funding part of that work. We will also fund ecological restoration and habitat management to increase resiliency. We'll look at nature-based storm damage protection. That might be right-sizing a culvert or doing more of a comprehensive flooding plan for a town. Drought prevention techniques, water quality and water infiltration techniques. We'll also look at solutions to reduce vulnerability to extreme heat and poor air quality. The town of Natick is doing a full tree planting plan to mitigate heat islands and reduce runoff, so looking at both of those. And then other nature-based solutions to reduce vulnerability to climate change impacts. This one I'm going to skip because we covered a lot of this. So in 2018, we had 82 new planning grants, and as I mentioned, this is now 43% of the Commonwealth is participating in the planning portion of this program, 156 communities, and we had 37 action grant projects. And this was a almost $7.5 million committed so far to this work. We are anticipating the release of the next round of funding this month or early January, depending on how things go. So you should keep your eyes out for the new RFR requesting submissions for this program. And here's just the map again, so you can see the communities who are participating so far, and I can also send one of Essex County specifically. I didn't have that map for today, but any of the dark blue communities are communities that have gone through the planning process already. So that was in 2017. The light blue are current year participants, communities who are going through planning this year. And then the hatches show areas where communities are participating in regional clusters. And so one of the things that we really wanted to do with this program was to offer the opportunities for communities that have good working relationships with their neighbors to work together, knowing that climate change and many of the solutions to adapt to climate change are really regional in nature. They cross boundaries. And while we wanted to give communities the ownership at the local level to do this work, much of this work is actually best addressed at a regional scale. And so there are a number of communities who are planning together, and also a number of communities who have planned individually, who then are interested in working together in regional groups to implement some of the actions that need to take place. I also wanted to mention, back to this idea of nature-based solutions and sort of the importance of the conservation piece in this work. There was just a study that came out that the Nature Conservancy was involved in that showed that natural climate solutions, conserving land, restoring ecosystems, in implementing green infrastructure and low impact development techniques has the potential to mitigate, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the country by 21%, which is the equivalent of taking every car and truck in America off the road. So it's a significant portion. And in Massachusetts, we already get 15% of our, we already have a 15% mitigation value from nature and natural resources. And so this is a really great untapped, not untapped here, but could be tapped more resource. And so many of these solutions that help us adapt to climate change also mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. They're sort of a two-pronged solution. And so it's one of the reasons we've really tried to focus on encouraging nature-based solutions in our program here. So one of the questions we've gotten is how the land conservation community can really help us work on this, work on implementing the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. And so this is just a handful of ideas. I think there's a lot more. But certainly, many communities don't have the capacity to apply for grants themselves, so working to help your community apply to the program. We have bidding sessions every year to explain the RFR, going to those, talking with us to figure out how to put in a good application. For our planning grants, so far we've been able to let everyone who's applied in, so that's good to know. It's a 6-question application. I think it's 7 questions now, and we require letters of support. It's a pretty basic application, but it still takes some time. I think what really takes the time is helping as a core team member and attending workshops. Because this planning grant is so focused on the workshop, it really matters who's in the room for the workshop. If there's no one in the workshop who cares about natural resources or nature-based solutions, those won't come up. Because it is really, the content is derived from the workshop participants. And so I'd really encourage you to attend workshops in your community if the MVP program is active in your community. And then recruiting workshop participants to join the effort. I think another important piece is helping to tie existing conserved lands in your community and to show these lands as a strength to this effort. Bringing ideas on nature-based solutions, so if you have expertise in that, or if you are able to do some research in that area, or find groups in your community that have that expertise, bringing those groups into the workshop is important. And then partnering with your community to complete action grants or deploy nature-based solutions. And I think one of the opportunities for land trusts is to use existing open space for some of these nature-based projects. So if there's an opportunity to do restoration or to really show how natural resources can be put into action for climate change adaptation, that's another opportunity. So I just wanted to leave you with some program information, and I will pass this on to the organizers as well. We have a program page for the program, and we also have that website, resilientma.org, where the program information is, and our contact information is also up there as well. And as I mentioned, we are looking at the next grant round in either December or January of this year. And we have about a little less than $8 million this year to do it. So there's significant funding. And for folks whose community is already planning, there will also be action grants. So I think I can take maybe a question or two. Okay, yes.
Do you happen to know how many other states in the country are involved in climate change preparedness or mitigation or work in general?
Yeah, so we're in a collaboration called the U.S. Climate Alliance right now that has 16 other states, well, 15 states and us, and those states are certainly very actively involved in both mitigation and adaptation. And have looked to our program here to expand it into other states. The Nature Conservancy is actually working on that to help bring this program to those 16 other states. Beyond those states, it's a little more spotty. So there are states who are working on clean energy, certainly. Texas has done a lot with clean energy, even though they're not necessarily working on climate change. And then a number of other states have done sort of adaptation and resiliency work, like Alaska's not doing much on mitigation, but they're doing work on adaptation. So it's less than half at this point. Yeah.
Combined sewer overflows are a huge problem, especially along the Merrimack River.
Yeah.
Where does that fit into this program?
So that is something that could potentially be looked at and planned for through this program. We're at the point where we're very open to different projects coming in and seeing what the potential is, but ideas to mitigate combined sewer overflow is certainly something we would look at through the action grants. Okay, one more, yeah.
If you already have an MVP plan
Yes.
in place, and maybe not the right people in the room or people who can
Yes.
it's important to adapt, and I gather one can have a listening session,
Yes.
sort of add on, and you can modify it, so you can perhaps get the people who weren't invited as the town more important and the people more aware, maybe a public listening session?
Yes. So one of the things we require is a public listening session. That may have already happened as well, because we require that in the first year. But one of the steps a town can take towards keeping their designation active is actually going back, conducting another listening session or another meeting of the core team to update the plan. And we have sort of been giving guidance to communities that they may not have had everyone in the room the first time, and there may be things they need to do, particularly now that we have this action grant with clear criteria about nature-based solutions. A number of communities came in this year with projects that really weren't focused on those types of things. And it's not so much that we don't want to fund projects that are needed, it's just that this particular grant is focused on nature-based solutions. And so something like a generator is not going to get funding through our action grant, even though it has funding. There's other funding opportunities. And so we would encourage communities to get back together, having now seen the action grant criteria, and try to structure more projects towards that criteria. Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. All right. Thank you very much.